Yeah. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce the second speaker in the S3D series this year. This is Mayank Goel, one of our own faculty members here, associate professor in S3D with a joint appointment in HCI. So he works on developing new sensor systems that, in fact, often using sensors already in the environment, like the sensors on your phone and so on, to do innovative kinds of things, including health sensing, technologies for global development, interactive systems. I was just talking with him about how he's gotten some of his work recently in products from Google and Apple and Meta. So that's super exciting, as well as in the medical work in clinics around the world, and some of it going through regulatory approval. So a lot of work with interesting impact, and also some impact in terms of students as well, with 5 PhD graduates who are doing interesting things in labs and universities around the world. So Mayank, please tell us about your work.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. And thank you everyone for coming to my practice job talk. That be a conflict of interest. This is just a undistinguished seminar talk. The distinguished talks are later in the semester. But in any case, thanks a lot. So today I'm going to talk about building 1 billion medical devices and how we can use far from perfect machine learning in healthcare. Now, when I say 1 billion medical devices, I don't want to scare some of the PhD students or master's students here, thinking that we have to build 1 billion PCBs and 3 different billion prototypes and things. We do some of that, not at that scale, but in most cases, we are going to use devices that we already have with us. I started with the phone, but over the years, as other devices have become more prevalent, we have started using them as well. But before we dig into these devices and all the technology, there is a fundamental question some of you might have, that why do we need health devices outside the clinic? This is life expectancy chart starting from 1990. The data sort of is only until 2019, but still life expectancy seems to be increasing. We have been going to a doctor for close to a century, and if you are a king of some place, doctors were coming to you. And it seems to be serving us well. So why do we need these medical devices outside the clinic? Turns out we are living longer, but we are also living sicker. So here you can see years lived with disability has also been increasing. I chose 3 disabilities here, but the chart is going to look very similar for almost all diseases. So we are living sicker. So we are living with more sicknesses that we need to detect, treat, and in many cases manage throughout our lives. And that's where we really need to take matter into our own hands, because there are a lot of gaps. There are gaps in time. We see the doctor only a few times a year, right? If you're like me, you would probably see a doctor only once, unless they start bugging you. There's also a huge access and expertise gap in many parts of the world. One example I often give is of this chest clinic in Bangladesh that I went in 2015, and it was the only chest clinic in a 100-mile radius in that region. And Bangladesh is not, and this is not the worst example, and that doctors saw 50 to 100 patients every single day. And as I said, there are much worse examples in the world. So the overall gap in access and expertise in healthcare is huge. And all of us here in the US as well sort of felt that gap during the pandemic. How many of you used a pulse ox during the pandemic? I see close to half of us raising our hands here. Same is true for me as well. I actually sent a couple of these pulse ox to India as well, to my parents. And COVID in many ways was an eye-opener for all of us. For me, professionally as well, I had built many devices that I claimed can be used as medical devices, had apps that you could install on your phones. Some of them were related to respiratory illnesses that in theory could be used during the pandemic, but it wasn't really useful because things were not ready. Now, in the past, I had built some respiration sensing devices as well. But as I mentioned, that none of the things were ready to be used in the world, by actual patients at that point. And it hit really close to my personal lives in a lot of ways. During the Delta COVID wave, everyone in my family in India got COVID at the same time. They all recovered, they're all doing fine, thankfully. But my mom was in ICU for 5 days. Right before that, the doctor said that, okay, she's at risk. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that her breathing rate does not go, I think, higher than like 22 breaths per minute, somewhere around that. I was here in the US and I was like, wait, I've built so many things that people can really use to measure their respiration, but I can't help my mom right now because there is nothing that she can use in this moment. So I actually did something. I threw together an app, a web app. 95% of the code for this was already there in someone's blog. I just did a quick Google search and found something. And the code is also like just 100 lines or maybe less than that. But I'll show you a quick instance, like a quick example of that. I usually don't look that angry. I'm just looking angry in this image because I was concerned about this video and what I'm recording. So what you see here is an angry me, and then you see these dots, and in some cases small lines. They are basically, this is optical flow. It is basically keeping track of movement of pixels at that position. And I'll play this video and you'll see some of these dots move as I move my head, and like this is my reaction to my talk right now. Now I'm saying yes, okay. But you see, you get the point, right? So this is usually used to keep track of objects in a video, or like the movement in a video. Then what I did was I basically asked my brother, who was in India with my parents, to install or to set this app on his laptop. And I started recording the video of my mom breathing. This is not a video of my mom. I actually asked my wife to help me record one more. And what you are seeing here, at the top, you'll see a lot of this movement, but all of that is canceling each other out because that's just noise. The main thing that you see here in this white squiggly is the subtle movement of the torso as the person is breathing, like inhaling and exhaling. Very simple app. The code, as I said, was already there, 100 lines of code. I probably added 10 lines of code to make the output somewhat clearer. And I just played that on my brother's laptop for 2 nights to keep track of my mom's respiration rate at night when rest of the family was sleeping, because they also had COVID. It just wasn't that bad for them. And it worked like a charm. I was able to control the lighting condition because I could just wake up my dad and tell him if anything went wrong. I was able to ask them to adjust laptop and everything. So this was an elegant solution because all you needed was a camera and it ran completely on the edge. And the user in this case, well, who's the user here? Who's the user of the technology?
Doctors. Doctor.
Sorry, I didn't get it.
Doctor.
Doctor. No, in this case.
You.
It's me, right? It's me. And I'll self-indulge a bit here. This is my favorite part. I am, as a user, I am rich, motivated, trained to use, trained to build. I almost built that solution and invested for a short time. I only needed to do it for 2 days. If I had to do it for like a year, it would have been hard. Right? I would not be that motivated as well at that point, unless it's really about my mom. So I'm the user and I'm motivated. But one of the ethos of HCI, especially here at CMU, is the user is not like me. A typical user is not going to be like me. A typical user is not going to be motivated enough, is not going to be trained, would have little time, does not know what to do with the data, and would not know how to interpret anything new. If you look at the graphic I have of the user there, it's not just the patient, it's a doctor as well. All these things apply to the doctors as well. As Insuk pointed out, the doctor is also a user in this case. And I'll talk about some of my work on how we keep the burden on the users low while they use some of these health systems. And I'll start with one area that we have been focusing on quite a bit in the last a few years is mental health. That could be depression, panic, fatigue, many other aspects. I'll mostly focus on depression today. And this is an important problem because, again, starting from 1990, the data, I just don't have data for that, but this was probably a growing problem since many years. The number of cases of depression have been increasing. This is especially a huge problem in colleges and universities. Almost 33% college students suffer from depression. The number might vary depending on university to university. I'll show in a few slides, this number is worse in tier 1 universities like CMU, Stanford, and other places. And the reason, oftentimes students are confused between stress and depression. They are told that some amount of stress is natural in an academic environment, but then they get confused. Is it stress that I'm feeling, or is it really depression? And there is a gap in understanding for the student, right, between stress and depression. And in the measurement, there is a gap for the doctor as well, because when a patient talks to the doctor is only getting a subjective view of the patient's condition in that moment. So we want a solution that minimizes the user burden, but also provides a context to the user here. It could be the patient or the doctor. So I'll show you some symptoms. So in the italics here, these are the symptoms of depression, some of the symptoms of depression. So there are things like trouble sleeping or sleeping too much, so sleep disturbances, loss of energy, increased fatigue, purposeless physical activities, and then reduced social interactions. Now I've paired them with the sensors that we can use to somewhat measure these these depression symptoms. So we can get sleep disturbances from a sleep sensor, very coarse sleep sensor that many of us might have on our fitness trackers like Fitbit. Loss of energy is something we can estimate using the number of step counts someone took in a day. Physical activity and some of the reduced interactions, social interactions we can get by looking at someone's location track and how many places did someone visit. And then for other kinds of social interactions, the remote social interactions, we can look at number of phone calls someone made, number of messages someone sent. And we also keep track of how many Bluetooth devices are around us at that moment. So for example, if this app was running on your phone right now, it would sense a lot of Bluetooth devices. So the system might be able to infer that you are probably in a classroom, in a lecture or something right now. So using all this data, we actually collected this data. This was done with many of my collaborators. I was actually not personally involved in the data collection of the study. I have started giving this disclaimer because there was this one time I gave this talk and I didn't realize that the people who collected the data were in the audience. And I'm like, wait, isn't that my study? So I always say that I was not involved in the data collection, but the models that were built, like I was involved in that. But in any case, coming back to this, we collected data from 138 first-year college students here at CMU. The semester, this was during the spring semesters. It used to be 16 weeks long. That's what you see on the x-axis here. The sensors I showed on the previous slide, we collected data from all of those sensors during these 16 weeks. And then at the beginning and at the end of the semester, we did subjective questionnaires with these 138 students and asked them about their depression symptoms. There was one at the beginning and one at the end of the semester. And then the modeling question, one of the modeling questions that we had was, how much data from this 16-week period do we need to predict whether the student will feel depressed at the end of the semester? The initial data was only to ground the model, and I'm not going to talk about the results from that. But the main question was, how much data do we need to identify the depression symptom as reported by the student at the end? So these are the results for that. With just 1 week worth of data, we were not doing very good in predicting the depression symptom that was reported at the week 16. This is a baseline, which is basically just saying whatever the majority classes, just keep predicting that. So 59.4%, close to 60% students did not have any depression symptoms. So which means 40% people had some depression symptoms. It is very close to the baseline. But as we get more and more data, we peak around week 7 with 92.4% accuracy in identifying depression symptoms. But then the accuracy tanked. What do you think happened?
Midterms.
Who said midterms? So that's a teacher. Is there anything else that happens around the middle of the semester?
Mid-semester break.
Mid-semester break, right? So we don't know whether it is a midterm or whether it's a spring break or maybe a combination of both. But the main point is that the student behavior changed. And the model was not able to account for that. The accuracy went down, and then slowly it kept coming back up again, but it never went back to the same level as what it was there in week 7. With some changes to the modeling and ignoring those couple of weeks, maybe the accuracy will be better, but we haven't done that analysis. But still, before the middle of the semester, we were able to predict with very high accuracy how the depression symptoms will be for students.
So this is cumulative?
No. Yes. The results are not cumulative. The data used at that point is cumulative. So we had a cumulative results kind of thing as well, that what is the prediction at week 1, week 2, week 3. So we did a majority vote, and then the noise wasn't really there, but we never sort of got to that 92.4% thing that we had without cumulating the decisions. Coming to your point, the data was cumulated every week. So this was a fairly strong result overall, but student population is not same as general population. It works for college students. It actually doesn't work well when you take the same model and apply it to a different college student population. For example, some of my collaborators are now at University of Washington. They took the same model, applied it there, did not work. They had to collect data again there. We are working on some approaches to improve that generalizability now, but I don't have those results yet. But overall, these populations are not the same, right? First year college students at CMU mostly stay in dorms. They take similar classes. They have spring break, midterms, everything around the same time. So we worked with another patient population where depression symptom is again very common. 33 to like around 35% people with multiple sclerosis have mental health and fatigue related issues as well. So a doctor reached out to us, and they have a really long-term study going on where they are keeping track of multiple sclerosis patients' symptoms for all these different conditions. But they wanted to see if our models could be used to identify depression symptoms as well. So we, in many ways, replicated that study that we were doing with the college students, but now instead of 16 weeks, because these are not students, we did 12 weeks, or basically 3 months. We were collecting same data that we were collecting earlier, but we changed the ground truth or the subjective questionnaire that we were using. We used a different questionnaire called PHQ-9. I don't have a strong opinion on that. The doctor said they prefer PHQ-9 over PDI-2. These are two competing surveys, so we started using that one. Another change we made was, instead of just doing these surveys at the beginning and at the end of the data collection period, we actually did it every month or twice a month. And because multiple sclerosis is a condition where there are many different comorbidities, apart from tracking depression, we also asked people about their fatigue, sleep disturbances, and overall multiple sclerosis symptom burden, which is like a multimodal survey that they do that keeps track of multiple morbidities. Apart from this, we had an EMA as well, where the participants received 2 questions 3 times a day. And the questions were basically, how depressed do you feel on a scale of 0 to 5? And how tired do you feel on a scale of 0 to 5? We basically found a collaborator who was fine with us asking as many questions as we could. And the student was like, yes, awesome, let's ask all the questions that we can. But that was great. We collected this data with 104 patients with multiple sclerosis. 30% of them had diagnosed depression, and all of them were taking medication. So it was severe enough depression that they needed like drug therapy. And they came from all walks of life, and their ages were between 37 and 52. And I highlight the age here just to highlight the difference with the college student population. The main challenge here was there is no common ground. With college students, they had similar behaviors, similar schedules. None of that was here. And then the other thing is, with students, we collected data during a semester. Here, these 104 patients were not recruited on the same day. It varied when the recruitment started and ended. So the best results that we were able to produce using the model we had already built was between 55 and 70% across all of these measures, because there is no common ground. But then a common ground came, COVID. And there was a stay-at-home period between March and May of 2020. During that stay-at-home period, the first graph here is basically showing the number of locations people visited. It's normalized, so don't look at the y-axis. It reduced. And then it slowly started coming back up. And this is showing sleep, the amount of sleep people were getting. And that increased initially because people were at home. So at least the commute time, we assume, was probably going into sleeping. And then that came back, unfortunately, back to the low levels as well. But at least that gave us a common ground. So we basically changed our modeling. So instead of just looking at the whole period as such, we said, what was the person's behavior before the stay-at-home period, during the stay-at-home period, and after that? And using that data, across different measures for depression, fatigue, sleep quality, and MS burden, we were around 80% kind of. So it came closer to what we had with the college students because we had this common ground. And the models we built here can really help patients to sort of self-screen themselves and seek treatment. And most importantly, for the doctors to triage the patients when the resources are reduced, especially during like the pandemic period. But then we went back to this that, okay, we didn't collect this data only to use COVID as that common ground. What are the other questions we want to address? Because we don't want just a model with 55 to 70% accuracy if the pandemic is not there. So we added two questions. One thing that was there in our as well as other people's previous work was that temporal changes in behavior was not really leveraged that much because modeling temporal changes requires a lot of data. Because there is no generalizability in many of these models, that was really hard to track. So we developed a new approach where we used a priori algorithms to not look at the temporality of the whole period, but just like a couple of weeks, and use that to ground the algorithm. And I'm happy to talk about the details of modeling later. But basically, the two questions we wanted to ask was, can we utilize these temporal changes in behaviors? And then second, these EMAs that we were collecting, do they provide any value? So here we have depression, fatigue, sleep quality, MS burden again. And instead of being in that 50 to 70% range, we are slightly doing better, right? All of these are within 70% because we were able to somewhat use that temporality between weeks. And then we added EMA information as well. And that helped a bit. None of these results are statistically significantly different except for depression. For depression, we saw a significant improvement, but for nothing else. And no matter how many EMAs we used, whether we used all of the EMAs collected 3 times a day, overall compliance for that was 80%, but so we still had like 2.5 EMAs per day from each participant. But overall, it's not very clear whether the EMAs are helping or not. And in terms of the effect of these EMAs, it can be viewed as a negative or positive result because the skeptics often say that we don't need to do passive sensing. We can just ask people how they feel. But we feel that this result sort of shows that just asking that it's not that simple because we often don't know how we feel. Because remember, one of the questions that was there was, how tired do you feel? And that doesn't seem to correlate too much with fatigue. Right? There's no significant improvement by just asking that question and adding that back to the model. But the goal here is not diagnosis. We want to build models that somewhat understand the relationship between our activities and our behavior and start a dialogue with the user, because the user would know about some of their behavior patterns and their connection between behavior and physiology. The doctor would know about some of them, and then the model might be able to unearth some more and use those for personalized interventions. For example, for a different study, we were looking at that if we make personalized interventions, can we help people sleep better? That study did not have conclusive results because, unfortunately, the deployment happened during the pandemic, where people's behavior changed significantly than what was before the pandemic. But that highlights another limitation of just relying on a technology-based solution. And I also, when I showed this result earlier, this also highlights a limitation of a tech-only solution. If there was a way to provide that domain and contextual knowledge to the model, that the student behavior is going to be different in that period, the results might have been even stronger. And that's what I propose here, that we need to get the domain and contextual knowledge from the user, could be the doctor or the patient. We want to build a real-time human sensor AI cooperation system. I added the sensor bit here to highlight the real-time nature of this collaboration, because how the sensor data interacts with the user can often be different than how a machine learning or an AI algorithm would interact. And the system can seek users' input in real time based on the sensor data or the machine learning inference. There's a bit of more of this real-time nature to this conversation. So we already did some of that with the mental health when we were asking patients for their EMAs multiple times a day, but we could ask about specific context as well. For example, there is a sudden change in your behavior. Is there something new? Like, is there something different today? Right? Like, for example, how our credit card companies say that there's a charge in Hong Kong on your credit card. Is that really you who is traveling or something else is happening? So we can ask people about a reason for change. Now that change could be on the inference made or could be directly on the sensor data as well. But it is important to keep the user burden low. And so what we want to do is we want to identify those moments of uncertainty, those moments of sudden change in behavior, and then ask the user to maybe provide us with more information. And I'll explain this idea a bit more using another project that we are working on, where we are looking at ADHD, hyperactivity disorder in kids. The diagnosis right now relies on subjective questionnaires, assessments by parents and teachers. And there is very sparse clinical observation because the doctor would see the kid in the hospital, in their clinic for half an hour or 15 minutes, rely on their observations at that moment, and whatever the students and parents and teachers report, and use that for making the diagnosis. So there are a lot of misdiagnoses for ADHD. For example, in 2012, a study in Canada found out that boys who were born in December were 30% more likely to receive a diagnosis of ADHD than boys born in January. And that's because in Canada, the school cutoff is 30th December. So if you're born in December, you are youngest in your class. If you're born in January, you are oldest in the class. So just the age difference is leading to a 30% difference. And that difference for girls is 70%. Because a younger kid is going to be more active, is going to listen to your directions less. I have two kids. I know this much better than maybe many of the people in the audience. And so we have to come up with something, right? Like if we can measure the context of the kid when they are hyperactive, it could be useful. So we collected a bunch of data, and what you are seeing here is a snippet of data from two kids, one on the left, one on the right. You're seeing the amount of motion over a 15-minute period. During this initial period for both of these kids, there is high motion, and we asked the parents what the kid was doing, and they were playing in that. Right? But in the second half, they were both supposed to be reading, but child A still has fairly high amount of motion. So most probably that child has ADHD and not the other one. And that was true with the doctor's assessment as well. That sort of corroborated with the doctor's assessment as well. But this contextual knowledge of what the kid was supposed to be doing was really important here. So basically, if we think of it as a machine learning pipeline, we have data coming in from some device. In this case, it's a smartwatch, it's an Apple Watch. And you have a motion-based hyperactivity detector, and it outputs some hyperactivity risk. So we need to add a context recognizer on top, that we need to figure out what the child is supposed to be doing or is doing in that moment. Now, where does that context come from? It can come from the sensor data that is coming from that smartwatch. We have built many models around that, and we used some of that, but that's not always going to be accurate. So we asked the parents as well. So the parents filled an activity diary for their kid at the end of the day at a 30-minute resolution. Now, at the end of the day, the parent might not remember accurately what the child was doing at like 9 a.m. in the morning, but you also don't want parent to report every half an hour. So that's something we had to do to reduce the parent burden. But we wanted to see that even this coarse information does not help in the final hyperactivity, the accuracy of the hyperactivity risk that we calculated here. And we collected this data for 65 children between the ages of 5 and 12, and 30 of them had an ADHD diagnosis. And we collected this data from 2 to 7 days across all of these 65 children. Now, the results here show different performance measures for just using the motion data and with the contextual information either provided by the parents or using our automated approaches of identifying context. There was no significant difference between context output from the parents or the sensors, so I've not divided that up here, but you can see contextual information is really helping across all of the performance measures. So even though the course, the assessment provided by the parents was very coarse and was probably very inaccurate as well at times, it still helped than just measuring the motion. So some contextual information is useful. But the goal here is really to help the doctor make the decision. So we took this data and we designed this clinical decision support system by interviewing 5 pediatricians and psychiatrists. And we came up with this design, and this is just a starting point that we are exploring further. I say that because I see Adam in the audience. I don't want him to critique too much. But basically what we have is a risk score, how that is changing over the day, over the course of the day, so that the doctors can see that does the kid remain hyperactive throughout the day, or are there specific moments in the day when they need more help or more guidance, and not just by time, but also by location and what kind of activity were they supposed to be doing. You can compare that with a control or like a typical child versus a neurotypical child as well to see where this child sort of sits as compared to those two. And then there is a risk score and things as well. Many of these things we added into the design because the pediatricians asked for that. So a big part of this is this activity and location or the contextual information. So we need that to be more accurate. The 30-minute resolution activity diary that we got from the parents was useful, but I think that if we make that information very apparent in the interface, but it's not accurate, then it might be a problem. So one of the things we are doing right now is we are calculating risk scores on the watch, or we are planning to, we haven't started the study yet. We want to calculate the risk score on the child's watch in real time. Whenever the algorithm detects that there is some risk, it can ask the parent or the teacher that, do you think the child is hyperactive right now? Or what is the context of the child right now? And see how that information helps in the decision making. Now, I'll take a pause here. Any questions? I'll spend 10 more minutes on a slightly different project, which takes us farther along this idea of real-time dialogue between patients and a computer.
Yeah, can you go back to the depression study?
I did not expect that. There is a way to do shortcut as well, but I forgot. Yes.
Way back. The one done in CMU.
One done.
Okay. The next chart.
Yep.
Yeah. So it seems as though the recent data is being swamped by the stale data.
Yes.
And so suppose you LSTM'd it and you forgot the earlier data. Would the prediction get better as you get closer to the end?
We tried that, and I think it will, but right now it's a data problem. When we throw the previous data, there is not enough data for the model to generalize. So the noise across the folds keeps on increasing, but I think it will. So we are trying to do that. Some of the researchers, actually there were a faculty candidate as well earlier this year who have open sourced some of the data sets collected at other universities. So we have now combined their data sets with our data sets, and it seems it's helping a lot, but I don't have the final results for that yet.
Is this like the model, is it one model fits all, or is it a personalized model for every age group?
No, it's like leave one out cross-validation. So, but in the end, the results are from like a generalized model.
Would it be better to do like cluster age groups and like semester-wise?
Right now, this is just data from first-year students in the same semester. So there is no clustering happening. It's like the data is very specific in any case.
But like in my FL class, federated learning class, we could leverage the statistical heterogeneity and get a better accuracy.
Yes, so that's still a future work. We haven't done that yet.
So I like the chart because here you have a baseline also that you can sort of compare with. In the study with the MS patients, I don't know whether you showed a baseline. Can you go ahead to the chart?
Yeah, so I didn't show the baseline, but the baseline will be 30% there.
30%.
Oh, so 70% there.
70. Sorry.
Because 30% people had depression. So if you just kept seeing no depression, then you'll be fine 70% of the time.
Right. The reason I'm asking that is because you're trying to compare with the EMA versus without the EMA. So there wasn't that much of a difference when you added EMA on top of what you were already able to predict. But how much does EMA improve over the baseline itself?
It doesn't. It was like a 2% improvement over baseline.
Okay.
How do you calculate the ground truth in the end? Like, what do we compare with? How are we getting the post-semester results?
So we do a questionnaire at the end of the semester.
Okay.
So we are just trying to see whatever class the student belonged to. Are we predicting the same class? So that's the result I'm showing here, but we also did severity, or was there a change in depression symptom as compared to the start of the semester? So for example, did anyone get better or worse? Actually, no one got better. Everyone only got worse or same. And that's just the nature of.
Did you at any point use the first questionnaire as a part of the modeling process?
No, we didn't use that in the modeling because we assumed that we will not have that data.
Was the questionnaire before finals or after?
Good question. I assume it was released during the finals week, but almost everyone answered it after the finals.
Do you recall like how easy or hard to motivate the parents to actually log?
It was actually very good. Yes, it was like 90% compliance. Again, their responses might be inaccurate, but the overall, like they were very motivated.
Was it like internal motivation or more like external like compensation?
Hard to tell. It wasn't that like like if you have to maintain that diary for a week, we I think gave them like $50, and they got no matter what like that money. So I don't think that was really the financial motivation. I don't think was that strong. I think the motivation probably just came from like internal motivation or the fact that they only had to do it for like 2 to 7 days, right? If they had to continue to do that for longer, it would have been much worse.
So I wanted to ask about your ADHD work. It's interesting. So when you report things like accuracy, you're comparing to a medical diagnosis.
Yes.
But a medical diagnosis is also inaccurate.
Yes.
So how does your accuracy compare to the accuracy of a doctor?
Very good question. So every participant in our study was in person evaluated by a trained clinician who specializes in ADHD diagnosis. So we hoped that that would reduce a lot of misdiagnosis. A lot of misdiagnosis is also because as kids are getting diagnosed by the pediatrician and not the psychiatrist.
Yeah.
There was a question in the back.
Yeah, I had a question also about the ADHD study actually. So ADHD has multiple presentations. One of them's hyperactivity, the other one's inattentiveness. And I was curious whether you found whether hyperactivity signals were also representative of folks who might have like inattentive presence.
Yeah, so we right now controlled the study only for physical hyperactivity, and anyone with inattentive type hyperactivity, we didn't necessarily record that data. They were still part of the study if they wanted to, but we didn't like control for that. And the reason for that was the clinician partner that we are working with, they basically say that sorry, I'm slightly disoriented, but they basically said that the survey that people use for inattention test, I forgot the name of the test, but that test is very accurate. So we don't really need an objective measure of inattentive type hyperactivity.
So since many of these things are working with clinicians, can you tell us which part of this work helps them, like that they feel like they're like, is it a particular level of accuracy that they're looking so that they could include that in their flow, or is this like they would likely use it to fill between the blanks between visits? What do you think would be the most useful thing for them?
So the answer changes from doctor to doctor. There are many doctors who assume that machine learning is going to be like many people is just going to be magic, and you can just replace everything with a number. Yeah. And then we are the ones then who have to sort of push a bit on that and say, let's look beyond that. For example, one of our collaborators was basically saying we should just show the final risk score and just report that how accurate do we think our model is, so that the doctor can use that information. And then others basically asked us to provide this information as well. And someone else was like, your activity information is fine, but that is an inference of a machine learning model that could be inaccurate. Given you collected location data, can you show that as well? Right. So everyone's requirements right now are different, but it's also because it's only done with 5 pediatricians right now. The answers might change as we do more of this.
One question is about the parents reporting. Is it possible that, given that they know, the questionnaires are part of this study, is it possible they might be biased in what they recall throughout the day?
For sure, yes. Yeah. And so that's why eventually you want to build systems that sort of just only ask them from time to time, and you have a system that tries to detect those biases. But right now, those are definitely part of the input to the system. And I think we had a follow-up. Yeah.
This is a separate question. So assuming that diagnoses change over time, like how you evaluate and diagnose with more research and whatnot, is it possible, or can you think of a scenario where your performance was low, relatively lower, but using these new diagnoses, the performance increases, meaning that your data are actually capturing something that the diagnosis technique was not counting what?
Yeah, so with that happens in many of the studies that we try to do, that we think that maybe what we are able to measure is something that the diagnosis is not able to measure. Because in my motivation as well, I said that, right? Like a lot of these things are really limited by what the doctors can use to evaluate. But it's really hard to figure out, unfortunately, it's really hard to figure out what's the right thing to do. How do you get the real ground truth kind of thing? So that has been a challenge, not only in the work I've been talking about today, but in many others as well. All right, so now this is going to be the last example of our work that I'll share today. And this one is farther along this theme of human sensor AI cooperation and dealing with imperfections of machine learning. So because we have a more involved dialogue between the patient and the computer here. So this study that we are doing is with skin cancer patients who have a surgery called Mohs surgery, where basically the doctor, the dermatologist, removes skin lesions from the face. At the end of the surgery, the patient has to take care of their wound for up to 2-week period. And what they get is this sheet, a piece of paper that tells them how they have to take care of themselves. So it will tell them that you have to take painkillers from time to time, and they have to keep track of that. Any of you who has ever had to do that, you know that this is a really, really hard problem to keep track of painkillers and whether you took this one or that one, and how do you control between those two. But besides that, overall, just taking care of the wound is very challenging, and up to 30% patients come back to the doctor with infections that could have been prevented if they had followed the right wound care treatment. And that is a big challenge right now, because all they get is this sheet of paper. So what we wanted to do was we want to develop a context-aware agent, because we have built all these systems that can detect a user's action. That is really the backbone of many of the things that I'm talking about today. So now imagine that you have a patient, maybe they're taking care of themselves, or maybe there is a family member or a caregiver who's taking care of them. But if their watch and maybe another sensor in the environment sort of just monitors their motion and figures out what action the user is doing, if they are doing something wrong, just intervene, that could be super useful. There's always going to be a helpline where if the patient runs into any issues, they can talk to the nurse. This already exists. This already happens. They are given a number they can call to whenever they want. And one of the things that doctors want to do is reduce the number of phone calls that helpline gets. Now, one of my collaborators, Jill Lehman, came up to me with a really interesting idea that the watch, any machine learning model that you are running on the watch or on the, I see some of the students in the audience as well who might not agree, but those algorithms are never going to be 100% accurate, right? So their idea, or Jill's idea was, what if we add speech? We ask the patient to, or the caregiver, to narrate, to utter what they are doing as well, because that's a standard of practice in medicine in any case, because the nurses tell you what they are doing while they are taking care of you. So if we make that part of the routine at home as well, what does that lead to? So imagine that the caregiver is saying that, okay, I'm doing this step, on that step, how does that work? But to build the system, we need to start from somewhere. So we first need to build a model that identifies the actions that the caregiver or the patient is taking at home. So for that, we did a study where we had a wizard who basically walked the caregiver or the patient through the whole task. That, okay, now do this, now do that. And they kept doing those tasks while also saying that, okay, I'm bringing Vaseline now. I'm washing my hands. I'm stepping into the shower. I'm coming out and all those things. So we did a study with the Wizard of Oz where the watch basically kept track of their motion. The ambient speaker, we didn't use that because collecting data with that was much harder and not everyone had that or was comfortable with the ambient speaker. In the second phase of the study, this is where we are right now. We want an automated procedure tracking where you have a machine learning model that is able to identify users' action and then it guides you through so that there is no wizard. An automated system is saying, okay, now do this step, now do the second step. But ultimately, we want to get to a point where the agent is not saying anything. It is completely passive. And it only intervenes when you forget something or you do something wrong. This is where we want to get to, but we are not there yet. So we did this study in clinic and in home with approximately 150 skin cancer patients after their surgery. The nurse basically trained them on how to take care of the wound in the clinic. And while they were getting trained and they were doing the task on themselves, the patient's data was collected and that trained the machine learning model. So it was sort of the synergy that during that process, the patient is getting trained on how to take care of the wound, and the machine learning model is getting trained on what are the steps that the patient takes to take care of the wound, so that we can then see how that data looks like in the home. Right now, we haven't compared these two data collections in clinic and at home, but that's sort of the thing we are working on right now. These are the steps that we ask the patients to do. You don't need to look through all these steps. This is not a patient, this is a grad student, Riku, who's working on this problem, because I could not show you patient photos and I could not take the patient photos as well. But like these are very regular kind of things, like washing our hands, applying Vaseline, cleaning the wound. Detecting these with machine learning algorithms can actually be really, really hard. So we did that. Vimal is here in the audience. He built a machine learning model to detect activities using motion and sound. It's called Samosa. I take credit for coming up with the name. And we tried to just use that model to identify the activities or the actions of that process. And it was only up to 40% accurate. I also show the results of another task that we had asked some of the users here to do. I added it because some of you might be our participants. But that was really bad as well. That was also close to 30%. But this accuracy was also really low because we were thinking of each step of the procedure as an independent class. There is always a bit of sequentiality to the procedures. If we incorporate that as well, and we use like a transition graph and incorporated that in a Viterbi algorithm-based approach, the accuracy is improved from 40 to 53%, and in the other case as well. But it's still not usable. And that's where the speech part comes in. Right now, this doesn't use any speech. So we did a simulation of that right now, that how much speech input is needed from the users. And overall, there are three kinds of questions we could ask. Tell me what are you doing? Or tell me when you do X, where X is a step that the model has identified as a very important step, or a step that the machine learning model is unable to detect. What are you doing right now? Because the model realized that I have no idea what the user is doing right now. Can I just ask? And then, are you doing X, a particular step right now? All of these questions, if you ask the user, it will exert different amount of burden on the users. So we still need to figure out how much burden is exerted, what is the right question to ask at what point. And we are running those simulations right now, but I don't have results to show. But one thing that is important that we have seen in the simulations is that wound care task was a 12-step process. As you ask user about more and more steps, the accuracy increases, or F1 score increases, and it peaks at around 10 steps. It is a 12-step process. So we really don't need any machine learning. Maybe what if we just keep asking people, what are you doing? And they just keep narrating. Maybe that will be fine. Not really. Because speech is also not going to be perfect, right? Because sometimes people just don't know what they are using. Some of you were participants in the coffee making study, or even if you are not, you use the espresso machine from time to time. What is this thing called? Do we have any espresso making?
Portafilter.
Portafilter, right? Not many people know that. So when we do the study and it's like, okay, I'm getting the coffee beans and I'm putting this thing into the machine. What is this thing? Right? Many people don't know that. And same thing was true for the clinical task as well. Like people don't know what is the name of that bandage or like that thing that they are putting on the thing. And sometimes the caregiver spoke too much. Sometimes patients forgot that they have to narrate because it doesn't come naturally to them. And as this data get collected in their own homes, privacy becomes a huge issue as well. And we are dealing with that right now, that how do we clean that data that we are collecting? And the patients sometimes forget to turn off the recording when they go for a shower or they use the restroom. So overall, across all these projects, in the end, I just want to sort of I'll talk about this as well. All of these things are work in progress. But the things I didn't talk about today is the backbone of all of this, the activity recognition models that we are building. The privacy and ethics, I sort of touched on that, but we are looking at those things as well, looking at interventions. And we focused on devices that we already have. But some of the students are also building custom wearables and other devices. And I did say that we have to figure out a way to use machine learning without making it perfect, but we should not give up on machine learning. So we are also trying to make machine learning algorithms better. Ultimately, what we want is a multimodal representation of the user. Think of it as a health kit that we have on our phones, but the health kit is just like a table of data. But if that data was more contextual, we knew what happening, and the doctors are able to use that as well. It's actionable. That's the kind of thing we are looking for. So you have information about your activities, your body pose, because that might be useful if you're recovering from some kind of a physical injury, and you have mental health outcomes, recovery estimates, all in one place. It doesn't need to be in one place, but the doctor or the patient should be able to look at it when needed. I'll give an example on context. So this reminded me that when I had my kid and I had to, at night, help him go to sleep, the rocking motion that worked for my kid was this, that I had to hold the baby and just move one leg like this. So I kept doing that. I had my watch on all the time. The phone was in my pocket, and iPhone, and I'm sure it's true on Android as well, keeps track of our gait. If you go into HealthKit, there is a metric called walk asymmetry. And it was really high for me. Because I have some injury, and because of that, I'm not walking properly now. But the truth was, I was just putting my kid to sleep 5 times a day. Like, at that point, if the algorithm had just asked me that, hey, did you have an injury? That suddenly your walk is asymmetrical. That could have said that like false positive in the algorithm, right? So those are the things we are trying to build, because ultimately 1 billion medical devices are going to be used by more than 1 billion users, because it's a patient, doctors, caregivers, family members, everyone, right? So we have to make sure that we keep the burden on the users low, but we also have to make sure that we utilize their domain knowledge, their expertise, and their intelligence as they use these billion medical devices. Thank you. Any other questions regarding the things?
So some of the studies were talking about sort of showing this data to physicians and clinicians to aid them. For other people who don't have some of these things but are like looking a little bit into sort of more quantified stuff, right? Like, I mean, we look at steps on. What do you think is the right interface to show to them that sort of that may be grokable, but also sort of like not cause extra anxiety, like just because your steps are down X%, right? Like, but if you did that for all of these markers, what do you think in the future? Like,
I think that's a very hard question, and I think that really depends from measure to measure and depends from user to user, right? Like, what is it that you really want? Maybe it's I didn't talk about LLMs. Maybe this is the time we should talk about that, right? Like, you just have like an agent that you're talking to, and that's just surfacing the information that you are really interested in that moment. But there's a lot of research that people are doing, that how do you make even the step count kind of information useful for the users, figure out how their needs are changing over time. It's something that we have not done, but other people are looking at that. Okay, you first want to encourage people to 10,000 steps. Once that has happened, now maybe they should be shown some other information so that they are able to sustain that progress, or be fine when they don't need to stress too much about 10,000 steps. 6,000 is going to be fine as well. But yeah, I don't know if there is one answer to that. All right, thank you. All right.
Yeah, so I have one question on the classification on the coffee making machines, like 40%.
Yes.
Now, how many classes are there?
19 classes for the coffee making task.
Okay.
19 steps.
19 steps.
I thought it was much simpler.
Yes. So every time you make coffee, you are
19
making like
steps.
19
chances of going wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, but the question was, how many classes were there? So is it a binary variable? You're making coffee or you're not making coffee?
No, sorry. So it's like 19 steps that you're opening the fridge, you are closing the fridge, you took the milk jar out, you put the milk.
But you're making a prediction as to whether the person was making coffee or not.
No, so the visualization is not accurate here. What we're really doing is, can we identify which of those 19 steps you are performing? And for that, the accuracy is 30%. So the baseline is going to be like 5%.
This is more like general questions. So you mentioned that you will plan to consider like privacy consideration during this kind of application. So what do you plan to integrate certain kind of privacy preserving technologies when it comes to this kind of data collections?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it depends from user population to user population. In some cases, when speech, let's say, is needed, just running everything on the edge is probably going to be enough. In some cases, it's like you press the button when you have to speak to the system and it processes it at that point and you are done. We are actually running a similar study with people with dementia in Europe, where the privacy laws are stricter. So just recording speech data is very, very hard, even if you process it on the edge. So there we have taken speech completely out and we are thinking of just putting some other sensors in their environment to improve the accuracy that we might just get from motion and sound.
So for this, where you're doing procedures, just detecting the accuracy of the individual classes is sort of somewhat useful, but it's really the ordering, and because sometimes are more important, right? Like if you you put the medicine before you put the gauze, after that whatever you did doesn't matter, right?
Exactly, right? Yes. So this is a simplistic take on that. That's what we are evaluating right now, that what is the important step? What should the agent really focus on? And how accurately can we then detect that step or ensure that we are able to do that? So for example, if the only important task while doing wound care is that you wash your hands before doing wound care, then you don't need to worry about it at the end of the task. Just in the beginning, as soon as the user says that, okay, I'm doing something, you're like, did you wash your hands? That might be enough. Similarly, for the coffee making task, it might be, did you close the fridge? Did you clean the wand? Right? It might be more on the maintenance tasks. So you just need to make sure that you come up with something where you are able to adapt to the different requirements of each procedure.
All right, well, let's thank Mayank again.